Rock music has always been built on chemistry, ego, and tension. But sometimes that tension reaches a breaking point, and the unthinkable happens. These are 10 stories of bands that removed the very member the world associated with them most and changed music history forever. Number 10. Dave Mustaine. A one-way Greyhound bus ticket from New York to Los Angeles. That was how Metallica said goodbye to their lead guitarist on April 11, 1983, handing him the ticket with no warning, no real explanation, and no apology as the rest of the band watched him go. Mustaine had co-written early Metallica material, brought a ferocious technical aggression to the band's sound, and was widely considered the most gifted player in the lineup.
I've never had a chance to be able to tell you without talking to Lars, the guy in Metallica. Never talked to him.
He was 21 years old. The humiliation became rocket fuel. Mustaine returned to California and formed Megadeth within months, driven entirely by the need to prove Metallica wrong. Over the next decade, Megadeth released thrash metal landmarks including Peace, Cells, and Countdown to Extinction, selling over 50 million albums worldwide. Mustaine has said in countless interviews that the firing never stopped hurting and that hunger never stopped pushing him forward either.
James kicked the dog, so I punched him in the face, and that was the end of it, you know? And the bass players...
Number 9. Pete Best. Timing was almost cruel. 2 full years of playing Hamburg clubs and Liverpool ballrooms, building something extraordinary from the ground up. And then, in August 1962, manager Brian Epstein called him into a meeting at his NEMS office and told him he was out. A new drummer named Ringo Starr would be taking his place, effective immediately, with Ringo's first gig coming just 2 days later. And all of it happening just weeks before Love Me Do was set to launch the band into history.
Pete Best, he was the original drummer in this group until he was bumped for Ringo. That took place in 1962. He is now out of the music business.
Best had been enormously popular with fans, often considered the most attractive member of the group, and received no meaningful explanation for his dismissal. The Beatles went on to become the most famous band in human history. Best largely stepped away from music. For years, working as a civil servant in Liverpool, before eventually returning to performing in the 1990s. He has spoken about the experience with remarkable grace, describing it in his memoir as a wound that simply never fully closed.
It was supposed to be matte paint, and John did it in gloss paint, and that was it.
Number 8. Ozzy Osbourne. They invented heavy metal together. Black Sabbath, born in Birmingham in 1968, built an entirely new sound around crushing riffs, dark imagery, and the unmistakable wail of their frontman. By April 1979, that frontman had become so unreliable from years of severe alcohol and drug abuse that the other 3 members felt they had no choice left. They called a meeting and told Ozzy Osbourne he was finished with the band he had helped create. Ronnie James Dio stepped in and recorded Heaven and Hell in 1980, which many fans consider a masterpiece in its own right. But Osbourne, guided by his future wife Sharon, launched a solo career that ultimately eclipsed almost everything. Blizzard of Oz arrived in 1980, Bark at the Moon followed in 1983, and by the mid-1980s, Osbourne was one of the biggest names in rock, performing for arenas full of fans who had been too young to see Black Sabbath. The firing created 2 legends instead of one. Number 7. Syd Barrett.
To borrow somebody's dreams till tomorrow.
In 1967, nobody in London sounded like this band. Pink Floyd, fronted by the brilliantly eccentric Syd Barrett, released The Piper at the Gates of Dawn to widespread critical interest, a record built entirely on Barrett's surreal songwriting and visionary guitar work. He had created the band, named the band, and written virtually everything that made them matter. 12 months later, he was gone. Barrett's mental deterioration, accelerated by heavy LSD use, had made him profoundly unpredictable. He would stand motionless on stage for entire performances, detune his guitar randomly, or simply not show up. On January 26, 1968, the remaining members made the decision not to pick him up for a gig and quietly brought in David Gilmour to replace him. never formally telling Barrett he was out of the band he had built. Barrett spent the rest of his life largely in seclusion in Cambridge, while Pink Floyd went on to record The Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and some of the most celebrated albums in rock history.
There is no other day. Let's try it.
Before we continue, which of these firings surprised you most? Did you follow any of these bands in real time and remember hearing the news? Drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you are watching from. Number 6. Don Felder. Co-writing Hotel California with Don Henley and Glenn Frey, Felder composing the music while Henley and Frey wrote the lyrics, should have been a career-defining achievement that bonded him to the Eagles permanently. Instead, the fault lines that would eventually destroy his relationship with the band were already forming by the time the song hit #1 in May 1977. At a benefit concert for Senator Alan Cranston at the Long Beach Arena on July 31, 1980, Felder and Frey reportedly exchanged explicit threats through gritted, smiling teeth while performing in front of a live audience, with Frey telling Felder, "I'm going to kick your ass when we get off this stage." The band broke up shortly after that night, and when the Eagles reunited in 1994 for the Hell Freezes Over tour, the tensions never truly thawed. On February 6, 2001, Henley and Frey formally fired Felder via letter, and he responded with a lawsuit alleging unequal profit sharing and wrongful termination. Felder detailed the full story in his 2008 memoir, Heaven and Hell: My Life in the Eagles, a title that captured the contradictions of his time in one of the world's best-selling bands with quiet precision.
It's just never enough. You still got to have more.
Number 5. Marky Ramone.
Take my baby away, take her away from me.
3 years after joining the Ramones in 1978, Marky Ramone had become one of the most recognizable faces in punk rock, his thunderous, precise drumming anchoring a band that played faster and harder than almost anyone else alive. By 1983, alcoholism had eroded that reliability entirely. The band let him go that year, replacing him with Ritchie Ramone, and continued their relentless touring schedule without him. What separates this story from many others is what happened next. Marky got sober. He committed to his recovery with the same intensity he had once brought to the drum kit, and by 1987 the band welcomed him back. He finished out the rest of the Ramones' career behind that kit, including their final concert at the Palace in Hollywood on August 6, 1996. He documented everything in his 2015 memoir, Punk Rock Blitzkrieg: My Life as a Ramone, a book that treats his firing not as a humiliation, but as the moment that ultimately saved his life. Number 4. Roger Waters.
On my fingers, got a silver spoon on a chain.
Exactly 17 years after Syd Barrett was quietly eased out of Pink Floyd, the band's second dominant architect tried to take the name with him on his way out. Roger Waters had written The Wall, Animals, and Wish You Were Here, albums where he was the principal, lyricist, and conceptual force, and had controlled the band's creative direction so completely through the late 1970s and early 1980s that Pink Floyd had effectively become his solo project. In December 1985, he formally resigned and filed legal action attempting to prevent David Gilmour and Nick Mason from using the Pink Floyd name.
Hot ashes for trees and hot air for a cool breeze.
They fought back. Gilmour and Mason won the legal dispute, retained the name, and released A Momentary Lapse of Reason in 1987, which reached number 3 in both the United States and the United Kingdom. Waters spent years publicly dismissing the post-1985 lineup, while that lineup filled stadiums worldwide. The two sides eventually reconciled enough to perform together at Live 8 on July 2, 2005, a reunion that generated more global attention than almost anything either had done separately in 2 decades. Number 3. Ritchie Blackmore. Smoke on the Water, Highway Star, Space Truckin', the riffs that made Deep Purple one of the most influential hard rock bands on Earth came almost entirely from one man's guitar. Ritchie Blackmore was the creative core of that band, the architect of a sound that would go on to shape everyone from AC/DC to Van Halen. And in 1975, mid-tour and amid explosive personal conflicts with vocalist David Coverdale and bassist Glenn Hughes, he walked away. He did not negotiate. He did not give notice. He left. Tommy Bolin was brought in as a replacement, but the chemistry never recovered, and Deep Purple dissolved entirely by 1976. The band reunited in 1984 with the classic Mark II lineup, including Blackmore, and released Perfect Strangers, to significant commercial success. But the decade they lost to internal conflict remains one of rock's great what-ifs, a reminder that even the most gifted lineups can destroy themselves with enough ego and friction. Number 2, Peter Gabriel.
Eagle flew out of the night. He was something to himself.
The costumes alone were enough to sell tickets. Peter Gabriel had transformed Genesis concerts into full theatrical events, appearing as a flower, a fox, and a series of increasingly elaborate characters, while the band played progressive rock of astonishing complexity behind him. By 1975, Genesis had built a devoted international following almost entirely around his presence. That year, following the exhausting Lamb Lies Down on Broadway tour, Gabriel announced he was leaving. The music world assumed Genesis was finished. Instead, drummer Phil Collins stepped to the front microphone, and the band reinvented itself as one of the most commercially dominant acts of the late 1970s and 1980s, releasing Invisible Touch in 1986 and selling over 100 million albums worldwide. Gabriel, for his part, built an equally remarkable solo career, releasing So in 1986 to global acclaim, with Sledgehammer becoming one of the decade's defining music videos, winning 9 MTV VMAs. Both careers flourished, which may make this the most unexpectedly positive story on this entire list.
Silence, I resigned. My friends would think I was a nut.
Number 1, Glen Matlock. Official explanation was almost too absurd to believe. In February 1977, Sex Pistols manager Malcolm McLaren announced that bassist Glen Matlock had been fired because he liked the Beatles too much. The real story was characteristically messier, involving personality clashes, creative power struggles, and McLaren's instinct for chaos as a marketing tool. Matlock was replaced by Sid Vicious, a friend of the band who had almost no functional ability on the bass guitar.
Like a kind of a railway track, all of us kind of going like that. And the big collision was where all the songs happened.
What makes this story quietly devastating is that Matlock was the musician. He had co-written Anarchy in the UK, God Save the Queen, and Pretty Vacant, the songs that made the Sex Pistols one of the most culturally explosive acts in British history. Vicious contributed almost nothing musically to the band's one studio album, Nevermind the Bollocks, recorded in 1977, with Matlock's bass parts largely still present on the final record. The Sex Pistols imploded within a year of Matlock's departure. Continued, performing and recording ever since, the quiet craftsman behind some of the loudest songs the 1970s ever produced.